They say the soul finds peace in silence, but here inside, the silence screams. It smells of iron, tastes of dust, and sounds like footsteps that never reach the end of the corridor. I've learned to listen to this silence like someone listening to a cursed prayer, a mixture of regret and relief. There are nights when the echo of keys wakes me, and for a second, I think it's the sound of freedom, until I realize it's just the jailer locking the world out. I don't usually tell my story. People don't like to hear about those who cross the line between love and sin. They prefer tales where the villain wears black and the hero saves the day. But what happens when both live within the same soul? When the act that condemns is the same that frees? In court, they said I took a life. In my heart, I believe I only ended suffering. And yet, the walls of that cell remind me every night that there is no redemption without pain. Some called me a murderer, others, an angel. Neither understands. If you've made it this far, it's because you've also loved someone so much you couldn't bear to watch them slowly die. I don't want your forgiveness, nor your pity. I just want you to listen to the end. Because before the fire went out, there was a name. And that name was my miracle and my condemnation. Nighttime in the hospital has its own texture, a patchwork quilt woven with silences and sounds hidden by the day. The 10 to 6 shift was my sanctuary and my purgatory. Outside, the city slept or indulged in its nocturnal vices. But inside, on the 7th floor of the palliative care ward, time was different. It was a stagnant time, measured in drips of IV fluid, in cycles of medication, and in the interval between one moan and the next. The air was heavy, a mixture of the metallic smell of cleaning with the sweet, unmistakable odor of illness, a perfume that seeped into the skin, the hair, the soul. I walked those corridors with the practiced lightness of someone unwilling to disturb the dying, but my feet felt like they were set in lead. The fluorescent lights buzzed like weary insects, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the sleeping or pain-contorted faces. The loneliness there was collective. Each patient was alone in his bed, isolated in his own suffering, and we, the caregivers, were neighboring islands, witnessing the sinking without being able to offer a lifeboat, just a piece of wood to cling to for a few more hours. There was a routine, a silent ballet of procedures that kept me sane, checking vital signs, administering painkillers, turning bodies to prevent bed sores, adjusting pillows. Each gesture was a small prayer, an act of service that gave me purpose, a shield against the despair emanating from those walls. I spoke to those who were conscious, offering words that sounded empty even to me, but which were all I had. For those who had already departed in spirit, leaving only their bodies in their final battle, I softly sang lullabies my mother sang to me. It was a foolish attempt to bring some sweetness to such a bitter environment, to remind myself that those fragile bodies had once been children, had loved, had dreamed. The night dragged on, and with it, the feeling of helplessness grew. We, the angels in white, were but soldiers in a losing war, fighting to provide comfort in a battle whose only certainty was defeat. Death was the true master of that place. We were just his servants, preparing the ground for his arrival. On that particular night, the silence seemed denser, the loneliness sharper. A light rain beat against the window panes, as if the sky, too, wept for the souls trapped there. I remember standing in front of the hallway window, watching the city lights blur across the water. I felt a profound disconnect with the world outside, a world of people going to the movies, having dinner with friends, sleeping in their warm beds without a thought for the fragility of the thread that binds us to life. In that hospital, life wasn't a given. It was an exception, a temporary miracle. Suffering was the rule, and I, standing between the life that pulsed outside and the death that lurked in every room, felt the weight of my job as never before. I wasn't just a nurse. I was a guardian of thresholds, a witness to the final frontiers of human existence. And that night, one of those frontiers was about to be crossed in a way that would change everything forever. The air grew colder. Or maybe it was just my soul preparing for what was to come. He arrived 3 weeks ago, transferred from another unit, already nameless, without a history, just a diagnosis. Male patient, approximately 60 years old, unidentified, multiple organ failure. To the hospital bureaucracy, he was a collection of symptoms, a body to be maintained. To us, the night staff, he became the man in bed 42. Room 42 was at the end of the corridor, a place that seemed to accumulate all the sadness of the floor. His body was a map of his lost battle. His pale yellow skin was stretched taut over bones that seemed ready to tear. Tubes protruded from nearly every orifice, connecting him to machines that breathed, pumped, and cleaned his blood for him. The only sound in the room was the whir of the mechanical ventilator and the monotonous beep of the heart monitor, a macabre soundtrack to the end of a life. His eyes, however, were the most devastating part. Most of the time, they remained closed, but when they opened, they revealed a universe of pain. They were sunken, cloudy eyes, but they still contained a spark of consciousness, a desperate light that stared at me, pierced me, begging for something I couldn't name. My duty was technical. Changing the IV, checking the machine readings, suctioning the catheter, recording the data in his chart. It was a ritual that allowed me to maintain a professional distance, a barrier against the tsunami of emotions that man provoked in me. But nursing is never just technical. It's touch, it's presence, it's the energy exchanged in silence. When I held his wrist to feel the faint pulse or wiped his face with a damp sponge, I felt the fragility of that life hanging by a thread. I saw the marks of a hard existence on his hands, the calluses, the scars. Who had he been? Had he had children? Had he loved a woman? What dreams had he harbored before being reduced to that condition? The absence of an identity made him, paradoxically, more human to me. He wasn't Mr. Silva or Mr. Pereira. He was the embodiment of abandonment, and anyone who could have been the father or brother of any of us. And this universality of their suffering made my task even heavier. The tension between my duty and my compassion was a lump in my throat. Duty said, "Keep him alive at all costs, follow protocol." Compassion whispered, "This isn't life, it's torture." Every time I entered room 42, I felt like I was crossing a minefield. I was afraid to look into his eyes for too long, afraid of what they would ask of me. There was a silent communication between us, a connection formed in the shared vulnerability of the early morning. He, vulnerable in his physical pain, I, vulnerable in my moral anguish. I found myself adjusting the machine that forced air into lungs that no longer wanted it, and my hands trembled. I was fighting against the will of that body, against the natural tide of death, in the name of an ethic that, at that moment, seemed cruel and senseless. The man in bed 42 wasn't just a patient. He was becoming my mirror, reflecting my deepest doubts about life, death, and the meaning of the word care. It happened early Tuesday morning. The rain had stopped, and an eerie calm hung over the hospital. I was making my usual rounds when I entered room 42. The light from the heart monitor cast a flickering green glow over his face, creating shadows that accentuated his thinness. His eyes were open, fixed on me. There was an intensity in them I'd never seen before, a clarity that broke through the fog of sedation. I approached the bed to adjust the sheet, as I always did. That's when he did something that seemed impossible. He moved his right hand just a few inches toward the ventilator tube. It was a Herculean effort. His fingers trembled, and a guttural sound, a grunt of sheer willpower, escaped his throat. My heart raced. I thought he was in agony, that the tube was hurting him. "Calm down, sir, I'll check," I said, in the professional voice I could barely maintain. He didn't stop. His eyes never left mine. Slowly, with a lifetime of energy concentrated in that single gesture, he repeated the movement. His trembling hand pointed to the machine, keeping him alive. And then he shook his head, a movement almost imperceptible but unmistakable. The world stopped spinning. The beeping of the monitor, the hum of the hallway, everything faded. I could only see his eyes and understand the message they conveyed with brutal clarity. It wasn't pain. It was a plea. He didn't want me to adjust the tube. He wanted me to remove it. He was asking me to die. The air in my lungs turned to stone. I took a step back, as if the physical proximity to that plea might burn me. I can't, I stammered, more to myself than to him. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, tracing a slow path down his sunken temple. It wasn't a tear of sadness, I felt it. It was one of frustration, of exhaustion. The moral conflict that had previously been an abstraction, a theoretical discussion for bioethics seminars, materialized there between me and that man. On one side, years of training, oaths, protocols, the law, my faith. Everything screamed, no, protect life at all costs. On the other side, my humanity, my empathy, the scene unfolding before me. A human being trapped in his own body, using his last strength not to fight for life, but to beg for its end. How could I ignore that? How could I force breath into someone who no longer wanted to breathe? That request wasn't impossible because it was difficult. It was impossible because it confronted me with two equally wrong answers. Saying no was condemning him to more days, perhaps weeks, of silent torture. Saying yes was making me a criminal, a sinner, someone who had crossed the line between care and execution. I left the room stunned, my heart hammering against my ribs. The image of his pleading eyes was etched in my mind. This was no longer the anonymous man in bed 42. He had given me a terrible responsibility. He had asked the impossible of me. In the days that followed, I became a battlefield. My mind was a trench where faith and compassion fought a bloody war. During the day, I tried to live a normal life, but the image of the man in bed 42 haunted me. At night, in the hospital, the war intensified. Every beep from his monitor was an accusation. Every time I entered his room to do my chores, I felt his eyes on me, waiting for an answer. My faith, once a solid foundation, now felt like sand. I had grown up hearing that life is sacred, a gift from God that only He can take away. Thou shalt not kill. The commandment was clear, absolute. But where was God in that room? Did I see Him in the cruel perfection of the machines that kept a body functioning? Or did I see Him in the desperate plea of a soul yearning for peace? What was more sacred, the mechanical beating of a heart or the dignity of a human being? Heaven seemed to have very clear rules, but here on earth, in the midst of suffering, the colors blended together and black and white disappeared. Desperate for an answer, I sought out the hospital chaplain, Sister Lucia. She was a middle-aged woman with a serene face that usually brought me peace. I found her in her small room, filled with books and scented with the gentle scent of incense. I sat down and, with a choked voice, told her my dilemma, omitting the details of my request, speaking only of my anguish in caring for terminally ill patients. She listened patiently, her hands clasped on the table. Her answer was what I had hoped for and what I had feared most. Our mission is to comfort, my daughter, never to shorten. Suffering can be a path to purification, a way to draw closer to Christ's sacrifice. We must trust in God's plans, even when we do not understand them. Her words were gentle, well-intentioned, but they rang like stones to me. Purification? What purification was there in an agony without awareness, in pain without purpose? God's plan seemed distant and cruel compared to the reality of bed 42. I left the chaplain's office more confused and lonely than when I entered. The rules of heaven, as interpreted by Sister Lucia, didn't serve me, and the rules of earth, the laws and protocols of the hospital, were equally rigid. I was caught between two dogmas, neither of which seemed to take into account the crushed humanity of this man. Compassion, the purest feeling that welled up in my heart at the sight of him, was condemned by both spheres. It was a sin for my religion and a crime for my profession. I began to think that perhaps there was a third law, an unwritten law, the law of mercy. A law that allows us to look into the eyes of another human being and recognize that sometimes the greatest act of love is to let go. But this law offered neither solace nor absolution. It offered only a lonely choice and a burden I would have to carry forever. The battle within me was far from over, but I was beginning to sense which way my soul leaned, and that frightened me more than anything. As the nights passed, something strange began to happen. My relationship with the man in bed 42 changed. The universal compassion I felt for an anonymous patient gave way to something more specific, more personal, and infinitely more dangerous. I began to see traces of my own father in his face. It wasn't an obvious physical resemblance, but something in the contours of his sleeping face, in the way the light hit his forehead, in the silent stubbornness of his chin. My father disappeared from my life when I was 15. He simply went out to buy cigarettes one night and never returned. He left a hole in my life, a wound that never healed, a mixture of anger, longing, and the eternal question, why? I had no photo of him to compare it to, only the faded memories of a teenager. And now, my brain, hungry for closure, for a face to direct decades of repressed feelings toward, began projecting those memories onto the stranger in bed 42. This projection transformed my dilemma. It was no longer a question of professional ethics or theology. It became a question of love and abandonment. Every time I cared for him, I felt like I was caring for the father who had left me. I would wipe his face and, for an instant, see the man who taught me to ride a bike. I would adjust his sheets and smell the tobacco and aftershave he used to have. It was a hallucination of the heart, a dangerous fantasy that tied me to him in a sickening, profound way. His plea to die, once a moral burden, now echoed with the weight of my own past. Perhaps my father had also suffered in silence. Perhaps his disappearance was not an act of cruelty, but of despair. Looking at the man in the bed, I saw the possibility of a different ending to my own story. I couldn't save my father. I couldn't even say goodbye. But maybe, just maybe, I could offer this man, this father substitute, the peace my real father might never have found. This twisted connection lit a flame within me, a mixture of love and sin. Love, because the feeling of caring for him was genuine, born from the deepest part of my need to forgive and be forgiven. Sin, because I knew I was using him to heal my own wounds. I was transforming a patient into a symbol, disrespecting his individuality to satisfy a personal longing. And the greater sin was that this fantasy pushed me ever closer to granting his request. If he were my father, what would I do? Would I let him suffer indefinitely, hooked to machines, like a ghost haunting his own body? Or would I give him the gift of liberation, the final act of a daughter's love, even if the world called it a crime? The line between mercy and selfishness blurred. I wanted to free him from his pain, but I also wanted to free myself from my own. And in this dangerous confluence of motives, the idea of turning off the ventilator began to seem less like murder and more like an act of redemption. For him and for me. The pressure inside me became unbearable. The unspoken words, the doubts, and the growing guilt needed an outlet. On a night off, I sat at my kitchen table with the silent city beyond the window and began to write. I didn't know who the letter was for. Maybe to God, maybe to the man in bed 42, or maybe to my father's ghost. It was an outburst, a confession, an attempt to bring order to the chaos of my soul. I don't know what to do, I wrote. Every day I see him, and I see the suffering that words cannot describe. And I also see a face that haunts my dreams, the face of someone who left without saying goodbye. I feel like life has given me a second chance, a terrible and twisted chance to right a wrong that wasn't mine, to give closure to a story that never ended. The pen ran across the paper, releasing thoughts I'd barely dared to entertain. I revealed my deepest secret, something I'd never told anyone. The week before my father disappeared, we'd had a terrible fight. I was a rebellious teenager, and he was a man tired of life. I screamed that I hated him, that I wished he would disappear forever. Those were the last words I ever spoke to him. The guilt of that sentence gnawed at me for 20 years. the guilt of a girl who, in her immature rage, might have cast a curse that became real. "Could this be why you've shown up now?" I wrote, the letter clearly addressed to the man from the hospital, as if he and my father were the same person. "So that I can undo my words? So that, instead of wishing you away, I can give you the peace you so desperately crave? Perhaps the greatest act of love I can offer is the opposite of the hatred I screamed that night. Perhaps the only way to forgive myself is to commit an act that no one will understand, an act that will condemn me in the eyes of the world, but that may save me in your eyes and mine." I continued writing for hours, the pages filling with tears and smeared ink. I spoke of my loneliness, my shaken faith, the burden of being the only witness to his request. The letter became a testament to my impending decision. By putting my reasons on paper, they became more real, more justified, at least to me. It was a roadmap for what I felt I needed to do. By the end, I felt exhausted, but strangely calm. I folded the sheets of paper and placed them inside an old book on my shelf, a book of poems my father used to read. The letter would never be sent, never read by anyone. Its purpose was not communication, but catharsis. It was my last appeal to reason, my last attempt to find a way out. And when I found none, when I sealed that confession in the dark, I accepted the path I had been set. The letter was my farewell to innocence, the final point in the chapter of my life where I was still just a nurse following the rules. The decision didn't come like a bolt of lightning, but like a slowly rising tide, and before you know it, the water is up to your neck. That night, the hospital was quieter than usual. A thick fog enveloped the building, muffling the sounds of the city and creating an unreal atmosphere, as if we were floating on a cloud. I felt it was time. There was a somber peace within me, the calm that comes after a storm, when you accept there's nowhere left to run. I made my rounds, attended to the other patients, and postponed entering room 42 until the very end, until the quietest point of the night, around 3 a.m, the so-called hour of the wolf. When I finally turned the doorknob, my hands weren't shaking. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm like a funeral drum. I entered and closed the door softly behind me. The only sound was the cycle of the respirator, a mechanical bellows inflating and deflating exhausted lungs. I approached the bed. His eyes were closed, but his face looked tense, as if even in sleep he was struggling. I placed my hand on his forehead. It was cold. "I'm here," I whispered. "I heard you. It's going to be okay now. You can rest." The words came with a naturalness that startled me. I wasn't a criminal acting. I was a daughter comforting a father. I leaned over and kissed his forehead, a farewell and a plea for forgiveness, all in one gesture. My mind was empty of thoughts, of moral doubts. There was only one focus, an absolute certainty in the act I was about to commit. It was a sacred ritual, a miracle in reverse. Instead of bringing life, I would bring the peace of death. My movements were precise, almost automatic, the result of years of practice. I turned off the heart monitor's audible alarm first, so the transition would be silent. Then my hand went to the ventilator's panel. My fingers hovered over the off button for a second that felt like an eternity. I looked at his face one last time, waiting for a signal, anything to make me stop. But there was only the serenity of unconsciousness. With a deep breath, I pressed the button. The hissing ceased. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life. It was an absolute heavy silence that filled the room, the hallway, the entire world. I watched the green line on the heart monitor. It continued its rhythm for a moment, then began to waver, to become irregular, and then slowly stretched into a straight, unbroken line. I stood there, still, holding his hand, as the life gently drained from his body. And in that moment, I felt a wave of peace wash over me. I had fulfilled my promise. The peace lasted only a moment. It was a bubble of silence and serenity that was soon shattered by the most dreaded sound in any hospital, the cardiac arrest alarm. Even with the audio muted in the room, the silent signal ran through the cables to the central nursing station, and from there It exploded down the hallway. A shrill, impersonal sound that announced failure and summoned chaos. The room door burst open with a bang. The light from the hallway invaded the gloom, blinding me. The first to enter was Marta, a younger nurse, her eyes wide with panic. "What happened?" she screamed, already running to the bed. Right behind her came two other nurses and the doctor on duty, Dr. Almeida. The small room was suddenly crowded with moving bodies, urgent voices shouting orders. "Arrest cart! Adrenaline, 1 milligram! Someone start compressions!" I stood paralyzed, leaning against the wall, invisible in the midst of the storm I had created. The world moved in slow and fast motion simultaneously. I saw Marta's hands pressing on the man's chest, a desperate and futile rhythm. I saw Dr. Almeida trying to intubate him again, screaming about the oxygen pressure. They were a resurrection machine, fighting with all their might to bring back a man I had just helped to leave. The irony was brutal. Every beep of the defibrillator, every shouted order, was a direct accusation against me. I cringed, wanting to disappear, wanting to rewind time, not to undo the act, but to avoid that grotesque spectacle of denial. They weren't trying to save a life. They were desecrating a peaceful death. The chaos lasted about 20 minutes, though it felt like 20 years. Finally, Dr. Almeida, sweating and panting, straightened. "Time of death, 3:27 a.m., he said, his voice weary with defeat. The others began to relax, their adrenaline subsiding. And it was in this post-battle silence that eyes turned to me. Dr. Almeida stared at me, his gaze not of sadness but of suspicion. "Were you here the whole time?" he asked, his voice sharp. I simply nodded, unable to speak. He approached the ventilator and examined the panel. "Strange, the machine is off." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and charged with meaning. Everyone in the room looked at the machine, then at me. Despair began to rise in my throat. The moment of accusation came not with a shout, but with the doctor's cold, calculating gaze. There, under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by my colleagues, I stopped being a nurse and became a suspect. The alarm had stopped, but in my head it would continue to ring forever. The courtroom was a cold theater, with actors playing their roles with rehearsed solemnity. The judge, a distant and impassive figure. The prosecutor, a man with sharp rhetoric who painted my act as a monstrous crime, an abuse of trust of the worst kind. My defense attorney, an overworked public defender, tried to portray me as a compassionate professional who acted under extreme emotional stress. And I, in the dock, was the silent protagonist of this play. I heard the words murder, qualified homicide, illegal euthanasia, and they seemed to refer to someone else. The woman they described, a calculating angel of death who preyed on a patient's vulnerability, was not me. But the woman my attorney described, a saint martyred by the suffering of others, was not me either. The truth was much grayer, and the judicial system has no room for shades of gray. The trial became a media spectacle. My face was in every newspaper and on television. Public opinion was violently divided. To some, I was a monster, a nurse who should have protected life and instead took it. I received hate mail and threats. Families of other terminally ill patients accused me of betraying the profession. To others, I was a heroine, an angel of mercy who had the courage to do what many would have liked but dared not. Euthanasia advocacy groups used me as a symbol. I was, at once, the murderer of a helpless man and the liberator of a suffering soul. This duality was maddening. I saw my own act distorted, simplified, and used to serve agendas that had nothing to do with what really happened that silent dawn. No one seemed interested in the truth. Everyone wanted a narrative that confirmed their own beliefs about life and death. The most difficult moment was my colleague's testimony. I saw Marta, the young nurse, cry in court as she described the scene, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. I watched Dr. Almeida coldly and technically present the evidence. The ventilator being turned off, the lack of any mechanical failure, my inexplicable presence in the room. They weren't bad people. They were professionals following protocol, declaring what they saw. But their words, in the formal context of the courtroom, became the nails that sealed my coffin. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to explain the connection I felt, the silent plea, the resemblance to my father. How could I explain this to a jury? They would declare me insane, unsympathetic. So I remained silent, the same silence that presided over the act itself. I let the living judge me, knowing that the only judge who mattered, the man in bed 42, had already acquitted me. For weeks, he was simply the man in bed 42, or the victim, an anonymous body that served as the centerpiece of my legal and moral drama. His identity was irrelevant to the proceedings. The crime, after all, was taking a life, any life. But for me, this anonymity was a veil that somehow shielded me from the full reality of my act. Everything changed one afternoon, mid-trial. The prosecutor called a new witness, a police investigator who finally managed to identify the patient. There was a formality in his voice as he read the report. After an extensive search of missing persons databases, and with confirmation of fingerprints, the victim was identified as Antonio Ribeiro da Silva, a native of Minas Gerais, missing for 20 years. The name, Antonio Ribeiro da Silva. The sound of those words hit me like a punch in the gut. It wasn't an immediate recognition, like in the movies. It was something more subtle and terrifying. The name sounded familiar, like the melody of a forgotten lullaby. Ribeiro da Silva. It was a common name, but the combination, Antonio. My brain began to work feverishly, rummaging through the dusty drawers of my childhood memories. I tried to picture my father's face, the face I'd been projecting onto the man in the hospital. The features were blurred, but the name began to dig, to unearth something. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a coincidence. It had to be. A cruel, sickening coincidence of fate. The world couldn't be so small and so perverse. But the seed of doubt was planted. That night, in my cell, I couldn't sleep. I repeated the name over and over like a mantra. Antonio Ribeiro da Silva. I tried to recall old documents, conversations with my mother. Her name was Maria Lucia Ribeiro. Ribeiro. Her last name. Silva was his. The missing connection, the missing piece, began to fall into place with horrifying clarity. The projection, the sense of familiarity, the strange connection I'd felt from the beginning. It wasn't a fantasy of my needy mind. It was the truth. A truth so monstrous that my consciousness had blocked it out, allowing me to feel it only intuitively. That anonymous man, that suffering body, that stranger who'd asked me the hardest question of my life, was ceasing to be a stranger. The weight of that name was the weight of a lifetime of longing and abandonment, coming to the surface in the most tragic way possible. I was being judged for killing a stranger, but my heart was beginning to scream that I had killed my own father. The confirmation came in a banal and devastating way. My lawyer, seeing my shock after the name was revealed, called a recess and did some investigating on his own. 2 days later, he visited me in the court waiting room before the session began. His face was pale. He carried a manila envelope. "I don't know how to tell you this," he began, and I already knew. He opened the envelope and took out a worn black and white photograph. It was a 3x4 photo from an old work card, found among the patient's few belongings in the hospital. The image showed a young man with a shy smile and the same eyes that stared at me in the hospital, but full of life and dreams. It was him. It was the face of my memories. It was my father, Antonio Ribeiro da Silva. The revelation didn't bring immediate screams or tears. It brought a profound silence, a vacuum that sucked all the air from my lungs. The entire universe contracted and reconfigured itself around that single truth. The act I had committed, already morally complex, was recontextualized in a way that defied reason. I hadn't euthanized an anonymous patient for whom I'd developed a kinship. I had turned off the machines that kept my own father alive. The daughter he abandoned 20 years ago was the same one who found him on his deathbed and granted his final request. The reunion I dreamed of all my life happened in absolute silence, in complete ignorance, and ended with his death at my hands. The irony was so cosmic, so cruel, that it bordered on the absurd. My lawyer asked me if we wanted to use this information at trial. It might generate sympathy, perhaps lessen the sentence. A daughter, acting out of love, reunites with her dying father. The narrative was powerful, but I refused. That truth was too sacred, too painful to be used as a pawn in a courtroom game. It was mine and his. To desecrate it in public, to try to save myself, would be the ultimate betrayal. The trial continued, and no one knew of our connection. The prosecutor continued to call me a stranger's murderer. The jury convicted me of killing a man whose name they could barely pronounce. And I accepted the sentence, carrying the secret of that rediscovered paternity like a burning coal in my chest. The world judged me for a crime, but I was dealing with a Greek tragedy, a story of fate, love, and death that no human law could comprehend or judge. After the revelation, the guilt shifted. Remorse for the act itself was swallowed by a much greater pain, the pain of lost opportunities. For 20 years I imagined our reunion. In my fantasies I screamed at him, asking why he left us. In others, I hugged him and cried, and he begged me for forgiveness. In all of them, there was dialogue, there was recognition, there was a chance to heal the wound. Reality, however, stole all of that from me. He was there, inches from me, for weeks, and I didn't recognize him. I cared for his body, but I couldn't reach his soul. He asked me to die, but I never knew if, behind the fog of illness, he recognized me. This doubt was torture. Did he know it was his daughter there, in her final moments? Or was I just another anonymous face in a white uniform? The forgiveness I'd sought my entire adult life, his forgiveness for being a difficult daughter, and my forgiveness of him for abandoning him, never came. The conversation we needed to have died before it began. Instead of words, we exchanged medical procedures and a silent plea. I became the instrument of his demise before I could even say hello again. The remorse now was about the stolen time, about the words left unsaid. I looked at my hands and saw not the hands of a murderer, but the hands of a daughter who failed to acknowledge him, failed to give him the chance to explain himself, failed to obtain the absolution my soul so desperately yearned for. This new layer of trauma was heavier than any court sentence. The prison, the bars, the inmate routine, all of it was secondary. My true prison was the labyrinth of my own mind, where I endlessly relived our last weeks. I searched for signs I'd missed, for a flicker of recognition in his eyes, for anything that told me he knew. But there was nothing, only ambiguity, silence. The guilt was no longer about having turned off a machine. It was about having silenced a story. I'd given him the peace of death, but in doing so, I'd perhaps robbed myself of my own peace forever, condemning me to live with the ghost of a reunion that was at once a definitive and incomplete goodbye. Prison life is, above all, noisy. The sound of metal doors slamming, keys rattling, shouts in the yard, orders barked by guards. Yet, amidst all this noise, I found a different kind of silence, an internal silence. With the sentence handed down and my fate sealed, the legal and media battle ended. The outside world moved on, forgetting my name and my story. And in this imposed stillness, I finally had room to breathe, to confront my demons without the interference of outside opinions. The days were all the same, marked by a rigid routine. Wake up, count, breakfast, laundry, lunch, count, free time in the yard, dinner, count, lights out. This monotony, which for many was maddening, for me was a blessing. It emptied my mind of the future and the past, forcing me to live only in the present, one day at a time. My faith, which had been so shaken, began to rebuild, but in a different way. I abandoned the rules and dogmas that had not served me. The prison chapel offered me no solace. My spirituality became something more personal, more contemplative. I found God not in sermons, but in the patch of sky I saw from my cell window, in the strength of a small plant that stubbornly grew in a crack in the courtyard wall, in the silent solidarity exchanged with another inmate through a simple glance. I began to understand that faith was not about following a set of laws to avoid punishment, but about finding meaning and connection amidst chaos and suffering. The silence of my cell became my monastery. Slowly, I began to make peace with what had happened. I relived the night in the hospital not with the terror of guilt, but with the serenity of acceptance. I understood that recognition didn't matter. Whether he recognized me or not, whether I recognized him in time or not, all of that was ego. What mattered was the act itself, the connection that existed beyond names and identities. One soul asked another for help, and help was given. It was an act of love, imperfect, tragic, criminal in the eyes of the world, but still love. The routine of prison, the loss of my identity, the isolation, all of it stripped me of my superficial layers and forced me to find my true self. And in that core, I didn't find a murderer. I found a daughter who, in the most extraordinary and painful circumstances, did what her heart told her to do. And in that understanding, I began to find a form of freedom that no bars could take away. About a year after my sentence, I received a letter. The sender was Sister Lucia, the hospital chaplain. My first impulse was to tear it up. I still harbored a certain bitterness from our conversation, from her dogmatic answers that had left me so alone. But curiosity won out. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Her handwriting was elegant, careful. The letter was not what I expected. There were no sermons, no biblical quotes, no judgment. There was only a confession. She wrote that, since my case, she had been unable to sleep peacefully, that my situation had forced her to question everything she believed. "I gave you the answers in the book," she wrote, "but life sometimes writes stories that books cannot contain." She continued, saying that she spoke with other healthcare professionals, with patients' families, and that she began to see nuances she had previously ignored. "Mercy," she wrote, "is not always fighting until the last second. Sometimes mercy is accepting the end with dignity. I don't know if what you did was right or wrong in God's eyes, but today I understand that it was an act of deep and desperate love." At the end of the letter, she didn't offer me forgiveness, knowing it wasn't hers to give. Instead, she asked for it. "Forgive me," she wrote, "for not being able to listen to your heart, only to my fears and my rules." Sister Lucia's letter was the symbolic forgiveness I didn't know I needed. It wasn't from God or the system, but from someone who represented the world of dogma that condemned me. It was proof that my story, however tragic, had touched another soul and transformed it. And this gave me a new peace, a new understanding that true faith lives not in ready-made answers, but in the courage to ask the hard questions. As the years passed, the cell walls became less of a prison and more of a cocoon. The external noise faded, guilt turned to acceptance, and remorse gave way to calm understanding. I no longer saw myself as a victim of fate or a criminal, but as a piece in a much larger story, a story of love, loss, and the invisible ties that bind us. The image of my father was no longer that of a man abandoned in a hospital bed, nor that of a ghost that haunted me. He became a warm presence, a gentle light that guided me through the darkness. I understood that he hadn't disappeared for 20 years to punish me. He had lost himself, as so many souls do in this world, and fate, in its mysterious wisdom, had brought us together at the only moment we could save each other. He needed me to free him from his body. I needed him to free me from my childhood anger and guilt. The true meaning of love, I realized, is not in holding on tightly, but in knowing when to let go. It's in recognizing another's pain as if it were your own and having the courage to act even if the whole world calls you crazy or a sinner. The spiritual freedom I found didn't come from a priest's absolution or a commutation of a sentence. It came from the profound understanding that night in room 42, I acted from the purest place of my soul. I didn't break a divine law. I fulfilled a higher law, the law of unconditional compassion. My act was the final point in his story on earth, but it was the starting point for my spiritual journey. He gave me death as a gift, and I, unknowingly, gave him eternal life through my sacrifice. Today, when I look out the small window of my cell and see the first light of dawn painting the sky, I no longer feel the weight of my sentence. I feel the lightness of a soul that has understood its purpose. The last light I saw in my Father's eyes was not of despair, but of gratitude. And that is the light I carry within me. It is the light that illuminates my cell, that warms me on cold nights, and that reminds me that, even in the darkest place, love can find a way to work its miracle. I don't know what awaits me when I leave here, or if I ever will, but I know that, wherever I go, I will carry with me the peace of a daughter who has finally brought her father home. Guilt, in the end, was my miracle. It was what stripped me of everything, what forced me to descend into the hell of my own soul to find what was truly essential. Without guilt, I would have remained a woman who lived by other people's rules, with borrowed faith and a heart full of unhealed wounds. It was the weight of my act that broke me, and it was in the shards that I found my true strength, my own voice. Mercy is not an abstract concept, it is a gesture. It is the hand that reaches out in the darkness, the ear that hears the silent plea, the heart that chooses love over fear. I understood that unconditional love asks for nothing in return, not even the world's understanding. It simply is. My voice now is calm, almost confessional. There is no more anger, no more justifications. There is only the story, raw and unvarnished, the story of an impossible reunion and a sacred farewell. I didn't kill my father. I freed him, and he somehow freed me too. He freed me from the abandoned girl I was for so long, allowing me to become the woman I am today. A woman who found redemption, not despite her guilt, but because of it. Each day here is a reminder of the price I paid, but also of the gift I received. Inner peace is a far more valuable prize than physical freedom. The sound of keys in the hallway no longer scares me. It's just part of the soundtrack of my life, the rhythm that marks my journey. The sunrise light streaming through the window grate is no longer a promise of a world I've lost, but a symbol of the light I've found within. My story isn't a plea for absolution. It's an invitation for you to look at your own lines, at your own impossible choices.
She didn't ask for absolution, only silence to love until the end. And when the hallway fell silent, we understood something we rarely admit. Sometimes the gesture that condemns is the same one that liberates. In that woman's heart, guilt wasn't a shackle, it was a path. Room 42 wasn't a perfect crime, but an imperfect encounter between pain and mercy. And on the other side of the fence, the question that doesn't fit into the codes remains: what is caring when continuing is only prolonging the suffering? If this story touched you, pass it on. Share it with someone who needs to hear that love also means giving up. Now I want to hear from you. 1. Do you believe there are acts of love that the world will never understand? 2. Where does duty end and mercy begin? 3. If it were you in room 42, what would the request be, and what would the answer be? Share your perspective in the comments. Your perspective may comfort those who are currently carrying an impossible decision. If you want more profound stories like this, narratives that confront our limits and illuminate what we still call miracles, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Here, every week, we transform silence into voice and guilt into path. And if this story caught you on a difficult day, remember one last image. The light that shines through the grate doesn't ask for permission to enter. It simply comes. May it reach your heart too. Share, comment, subscribe.